Right, good evening everybody. This talk is about William Goff Beale. His date's 1870 to 1923. And we begin by looking at the family, religious, business, social, political background of Beale. And he suffered a violent death in Cork in 1923, a very troubled period in Irish history. And Beale was a partner in an agricultural machinery and seed shop where the city library is now located. The death of Beale was quite definitely and provably connected with the political troubles of the time, and it also has aspects of confusion, mistaken judgment, suspicion, and it may be argued the targeting of an innocent man. William Goff Beale was a partner in the firm of Harris and Beale, and this agricultural and seed business where the city library was located is now located. His brother, at 57 Grand Parade, Cork, where he worked each day, his brother Charles Ernest Beale was a co-partner with him. The business had been set up by their grandfather Joshua Beale and Joshua's third cousin Thomas White Harris, both of whom were oil and colour merchants. And I have here a family circle chart. The upper one is Beale and the lower one is the partner Harris. And shaded in green is the Pym relations, in blue are the Harvey relations, in pink are the Deave relations, and in yellow are the Beale relations. So you can see that they were totally interconnected with each other and with various of the Quaker merchant families in Cork and beyond. Joshua Beale's wife, Hannah Cotter, and Thomas White Harris's wife, Susanna Deaves, they were both first cousins and were both granddaughters of Reuben Harvey of Pleasantfields in Blackrock. This is Pleasant, where Harvey's residence. Later it became the Ursuline Convent, latterly it's the Eden Apartments. Harvey had a timber and shipping business, and he corresponded with George Washington as an intermediary with the British government. He took an interest in the welfare of American sailors held prisoner in Kinsale. Reuben Harvey married in 1761. He had 12 children and was widowed in 1781. He was disowned by Quakers in 1800 for having criminal connections with women and for harbouring one in his house. But the real reason was more likely his liberalism and his political friendships at a time of revolution. Now, Quakers involved in the famine, in famine relief locally during the famine times were Beale, Pike and Harvey. Nationally, the two main leaders were Bewley and Pym. George Cotter, the great-grandfather of Beale, George Cotter, he was a merchant. He lived at Ashton Place in Cork. And the Deaves family came from Wexford. They were neighbours of the Goffs, who also came from Wexford, but Deaves came to the North Abbey in Cork City. They were initially involved in textiles, including a cotton mill in Blarney. And later they became timber and slate merchants, forming a partnership, Harvey and Deaves. Likewise, the Beale and Harris families were intermarried with the Pyms of Mountmellick, County Laois, who were merchants. Additionally, the Pyms were married into the Goffs and the Deaves families. And in the second generation of the Harris and Beale business partnership, George Cotter Beale's wife, Arabella Pym, and Thomas Joseph Harris's wife, Lucy Pym, were first cousins on the Pym line, and they were second cousins on the Deave line. And both the Beale and Harris families could easily trace their families back to the mid-1600s. Joshua Beale, 1658 to 1709, married Mary Hammond in 1686. That couple were direct ancestors by 5 generations of William Goff Beale's father, and by 6 generations of William Goff Beale, and by 5 generations of the business partner Thomas Joseph Harris. There were multiple connections with the family across generations, as well as 2 siblings often married 2 siblings, and there were ongoing business links with the families. In the main, the families were Quakers. Sometimes members were disowned for marrying out of the religion or for some other reason. The Children were usually accepted back into membership, particularly if the family wished them to send them to the provincial Quaker school. And the families were very often merchants. So the Beales were originally living at Meeting House Lane in North Main Street. This is, if you know North Main Street, between Leaders and Bradley's shops. That's where Meeting House Lane is. And when the Harris and Beale partnership was first established, probably around 1824 or 1825, Joshua Beale was then living at a business premises at 68 South Main Street. And both families prospered, and inherited wealth would also have been passed on within families. So George Cotter Beale was born at Joshua's house at South Main Street. Soon afterwards, Joshua and his family were living at 5 Adelaide Place by St. Luke's, and he also had houses at 1 and 2 Adelaide Place built for him circa 1832 on grounds leased to him by the architect George Richard Payne. George Richard Payne, his dates 1793 to 1838, built a lot of impressive places in Cork, ICC House, Grand Parade, St. Patrick's Church, Holy Trinity Church, Callahan's Gates. So there's an illustration of Adelaide Place from between 1837 and 39 done by a fellow called Rowe, and that appears in Windell's History of Cork. So Beale also leased the fields behind the houses at Adelaide Place for use as a garden from George Richard Payne. And Joshua Beale's business partner, Thomas White Harris, lived at Adelaide Lodge at the same place. So the Harris and Beale business is recorded at 68 South Main Street in 1883 Trade Directory. They were oilmen, glass and lead merchants and agents for Odham's Manure. When Joshua's son George Cotter Beale married, he and his wife Arabella and their family lived at Killora, Glounthaune for more than 2 decades, until at least 1893, and in 1897 they were recorded at living at Elm Grove, Ballyhooly Road, Ballyvilane. George was a clerk at the Cork Steamship Company on Penrose Quay. Between 1884 and 1891, the Harris and Beale business moved from South Main Street to 56 Grand Parade, and that building was owned by Joseph Thomas Harris. In 1884, when Harris was aged 58, he married his first cousin, Lucy Penn, who was then aged 50. Her address at the time was Myrtle Grove, Youghal, which some people might know was Walter Raleigh's house. When Thomas Harris died in 1889, his widow Lucy Harris, who was originally Penn, was given an annual income from the property at 56 Grand Parade, and Charles E. Beale and William Goff Beale ran the business. William Goff Beale was also a commission agent for insurance at the premises. When Lucy Harris died in 1912, the aforementioned annuity ceased, and the principal of the annuity was to be paid to her nieces. Photographs from 1910 show Harris and Beale's warehouse at 57 Grand Parade, as well as their business at 56 Grand Parade. So you can see on that under the window there, that says Harris and Beale Warehouse, and they were actually at 56 at that time in 1910. They were in the house next door, which is Sullivan's Auctioneers to this day. It appears that by 1913, Charles Beale and William Goff Beale then traded as Harris and Beale entirely from the premises at 57 Grand Parade. They retained ownership of 56 Grand Parade, and Guy's Almanac of 1920 showed the tenants as Gibbons, dental surgeon, and most notably the Irish Volunteers, Sinn Féin. So the Irish Examiner on Tuesday, April the 21st, 1921, advertised 56 Grand Parade for sale in present condition, held under a long lease at a small rent. For particulars applied to Charles E. Beale, 57 Grand Parade, Cork. So part of the present City Library housing the Children's Library on the ground floor was built and opened in 1930 on the site of the Harris and Beale shop. and it was extended in 1970. There was a library on the South Mall in Phoenix Street in the late 1700s, and a public library was established at Crawford Building at Emmett Place in 1892. This moved in 1905 to the Carnegie Library built beside the City Hall, and after those buildings were burned in 1920, the library was re-established 4 years later in 1924 at 2 Tuckey Street, a former RIC barracks, and it's currently the offices of Society of St. Vincent de Paul. And the City Library is now at 57 to 61 Grand Parade, with an additional entrance at Tuckey Street. And that was the entrance to the agricultural machinery business off Tuckey Street. And there's also a laneway, I think, that would lead onto South Main Street from that, a very narrow laneway. The Children's Library at 57 Grand Parade was built on the site of the farm machinery and seed shop, and which was owned by Harris & Beale prior to 1923. And the front of number 57 was rebuilt with limestone, elaborate Celtic sculpture, and it's crowned with a harp. And that's the place where William Goff Beale closed his shop on Friday evening, the 16th of March 1923, never to return. He had a regular routine. He got on the tram at St. Luke's Cross. He got the tram to St. Luke's Cross, and from there he walked to his home at Elm Grove and the Ballyhooly Road. No, sorry, no, we'll go back to that. That's Elm Grove, and I think this one in here is Elm Grove. And up here it says is police barracks. That's the Fox and Hounds now. Dunn Stores is about there. And there's a filling station across here from Elm Grove. And you'll see further on, that's the picture of the house as it was. And that's the gateway, it's still there, where he was shot. So he was shot at the gates to the house, and he died some days later at the South Infirmary. So what was the background and the context at that time in early 1923? So the Cork Examiner had reports about the terrible events in Ballyseedy in March 1923. And at the time, Cork had plenty of troubles of its own. On the evening of the 8th of March 1923, attempts were made to burn 2 houses. One of the houses was the residence of Mrs. Peg Duggan in Blackpool. She was a member of Cumann, and they had taken the anti-treaty side. The women's auxiliary of the Irish Volunteers is one way it's described. It took the anti-treaty side in the Civil War, and a group of armed men entered the house and sprinkled petrol and set it alight, but the fire brigade arrived and sorted it out and saved the house from destruction. But a second attempt was made that night to burn a house in Mount Nebo and Blarney Street, the residence of Mrs. Collins Powell. And the Cork Examiner stated that Mrs. Powell was the sister of the late General Michael Collins, Commander-in-Chief of the National Army. And a group of men entered the house. They saturated the place with petrol, and all the children and the furniture, and all the children were in bed at the time, and they were ordered out by the raiders. But meanwhile, Commandant Scott of the Army had arrived at the door to visit Mrs. Powell, and he knocked at the door as the raiders were preparing to set the house alight, and a young raider answered the door. And when he saw the commandant's uniform, he shot him in the arm with his revolver. So several shots followed, and the raiding party left the house under fire from Scott's military escort. So Commandant Scott was taken to the Mercy Hospital. He was treated for his wounds, and his condition was described as not serious. One raider was wounded, managed to escape, and in a search later, another raider was found hiding in the grounds. Near him was a Webley revolver and 6 rounds of ammunition, 2 of which had been fired. And the Cork Examiner named him as William Healy, late of Donaghmore, and his address at the time was 52 Dublin Street, Cork. So 6 days later, on Wednesday, the 14th of March, the Cork Examiner carried a report that William Healy of 52 Dublin Street had been executed at 8 o'clock that morning. And as well as several accounts of mail robberies, the Cork Examiner also carried a report that 4 revolvers and ammunition had been found in a wall near St. Joseph's Church in Mayfield. That's only around the corner from Elm Grove, where Beale lived. On Friday, the 16th of March, a couple of days after the execution of William Healy, William Goff Beale probably closed his shop at 5 or 6 in the evening and walked to the nearest tram stop and got a tram to St. Luke's Cross. And from there he walked to Ballyhooly Road to his home at Elm Grove in Ballyvolane. And his father had died in 1914. He lived with his 80-year-old mother, his sister, a gardener and a parlour maid, and he was unaware that he was being followed. When he was nearly at the gate, he heard a noise of 2 men approaching him swiftly from behind, and before he could turn, one of them challenged him. And they fired several shots point blank at him from revolvers, one of them saying, "This is a reprisal for the executions." Beale's household heard the noise, and Mrs. Beale opened the hall door, and the wounded man walked up the steps into the house and said, "They shot me." The parlour maid called the doctor, and Beale walked upstairs to bed and remained there until removed to the South Infirmary Hospital. He'd been badly wounded, shot through the back with an exit wound through the abdomen, and his mother, sister and fiancé stayed at his hospital bedside. He died 4 days later, on Tuesday, the 20th of March. And at the inquest the following day, the jury found that Beale had died from the effect of gunshot wounds inflicted by some person or persons unknown. His body was removed to the South Infirmary, from the South Infirmary to St. John's Free Episcopal Church. It's at the junction of Infirmary Road and Summerhill South. It's now part of St. John's College. And at St. John's Church they had a private service. And the funeral took place immediately afterwards to the Friends Burial Ground at Summerhill South. So Beale's grave is there, and that is the entrance gate from the Summerhill South is along here, and that building up there is at the corner of Douglas Street or Infirmary Road and Douglas Street. But right along outside there is Summerhill South and the bus garage up here, and the entrance gate past the meeting house into the burial grounds, and Beale, that's where Beale is buried. So he was buried next to his grandfather, Joshua Beale, who was involved in the famine relief work in Cork, and along with his grandfather's third cousin, Abraham Beale, who had died of typhus in 1847, contracted while engaged in famine relief work in Cork. William Goff Beale's father, George, was married to Arabella Pym, and the 2 secretaries of the Central Quaker Famine Relief Committee in Ireland were Joseph Bewley and Jonathan Pym. Joseph Bewley was the key instigator of the Quaker famine relief work in Ireland, and his colleague Jonathan Pym of Dublin afterwards became an MP. He would very likely have been a cousin, and both men made a huge contribution to the Irish people. But a much closer relative of Goff Beale was James Edwin Pym. He was William Goff Beale's uncle. He stood unsuccessfully for Parliament as a Conservative candidate at the by-election in Cork City following the death of John Francis Maguire MP. And he was also candidate for Cork City at a subsequent election, but failed to be elected both times. James Edwin Pym was a merchant. He lived at Eglintown, number 22 Middle Glanmire Road, and he was running Deves Brothers Timber and General Merchants on Penrose Quay and Alfred Street, and they were also ship owners. So if you take Arbutus Lodge as number 29 Middle Glanmire Road, if you work back up the hill, he was up there looking down over his businesses in Penrose Quay and all the rest of it. Now, Quakers are pacifists, and William Goff Beale was, according to the Cork Examiner, a most inoffensive gentleman who took no part whatsoever in politics. In 1923, the Beales had lived in Cork for 7 generations since the latter half of the 17th century. Some of the Beales were involved in ironworks, particularly in Monard, with iron and hardware stores at 6 Patrick's Quay. There's William Goff Beale's uncles. We'll come back to that maybe. That's 6 Patrick's Quay as it was then and as it is now. The Beales, this hardware store at 6 Patrick's Quay, it burned down, some would say in maybe questionable circumstances in 1960. The Beales had marriage connections with a number of families with the family of Robert Day, with the Pike family, with the Leckie family, and numerous other Anglo-Irish families of both Quaker and Church of Ireland background. There's a number of theories about the killing of William Goff Beale. Much is made of the existence of aspiring in the Young Men's Christian Association, based at the YMCA building in Marlborough Street. Gerard Murphy, in his well-researched book, The Year of Disappearances, 1921 to 22, states that William Goff Beale's uncle, Alfred Beale, was chairman of the YMCA. Alfred's son, Alfred Jr., and another of William's uncles, Henry H. Beale, together with both William Goff Beale and his brother Charles E. Beale, were all senior members of the YMCA. So here you can see that is that's Alfred Beale on the top. In the centre is George Cotter Beale, the father of William Goff Beale, and down here is Henry H. Beale, another uncle. So several teenage boys from the YMCA did go on to join the military at the time, so it's possible to understand why some suspicions might have been held in this regard. However, I believe it was because of their evangelical faith that the Beales had a history of involvement with the YMCA. They were, as evangelical Christians, they worked with teenagers to try to get them on a straight and narrow path and to encourage the formation of patterns of good behaviour. Elizabeth Fry stayed with Abraham Beale at his residence at the hardware shop at 6 Patrick's Quay, which is now Robert Scott House, when she visited Cork to inspect prisons and asylums such as Elizabeth Fort and the Women's Refuge for Ex-Prisoners, now Coláiste de Dávid on Sawmill Street, around 1827. And she stayed with the Beales because, like her, they were serious evangelical Quakers. The evangelical movement was not everyone's cup of tea, but it is for some. And many committed evangelicals, such as Elizabeth Fry, did great work for women in prisons and asylums, precisely because of their faith. And at the same time, Elizabeth Fry was absolutely not a radical and could be described as firmly pro-establishment. I do not accept that William Goff Beale was part of any such spiring. Apparently he was inoffensive, he was not a great organiser. He had been seeing his fiancée, Catherine Topp, for several years. And, that is, his fiancée was Catherine Topp. And there's a mistake in the top line there. It says Elizabeth. That is Catherine Topp's brother, from Pike's biography, the information. Beale had been seeing his fiancée Catherine Topp for several years, but he had lived with his parents and he had not got around to getting married. Catherine Topp erected the headstone to William Goff Beale and recorded her name there beside his name. Her grandparents were Richard Topp and Susanna Jennings of the Jennings Lemonade and Magnesia manufacturers. The Topp grandparents lived at Rochelle, Cork from 1829 to 1854, and they were involved in the building of St. John's Church, where Beale's funeral service was held. Catherine's father had been a fleet engineer in the British Navy. He was Richard W. Topp, and he married Catherine Martin from Brook Lodge in 1865. The Martins of Brook Lodge were relatives of Violet Martin of Ross, County Galway, the writing partner of Edith Somerville of the Somerville and Ross publications. Catherine Topp was born in 1875 and the family lived at Brookville, Brook Lodge, Glanmire. And as George Cotter Beale and his family lived at Killora Lodge, Clownthon for 25 or 30 years up to 1890, and the Topp family resided nearby, it is probable that William Goff Beale and Catherine Topp knew each other since childhood. On the 3rd of April 1826, 3 years after her fiancé's death, Catherine Topp, aged 50, of Brookville, Glanmire, embarked at London aboard the steamship the Orsova, bound for Melbourne, Australia, intending to reside there permanently. Her initial address was in Melbourne, but she died 2 years later on the 30th of June 1828 at Geelong, Victoria, Australia. And like her fiancé, William Goff Beale, she was just in her early 50s when she died. My understanding is, and my belief is, that William Goff Beale was in the agricultural machinery store in the Grand Parade, and a man came into the shop and told him that he had seen a female stranger in a particular location. And at that time, a woman was missing, and people in Cork were very concerned for her. He apparently struggled with his conscience and with this piece of information, and eventually decided that for the sake of the life of the woman, he should pass on this information. He told a clergyman, who probably passed the information further. My guess is that the woman who was missing at the time was Mrs. Lindsay from Dripsey. The information presented to William Goff Beale could have been a tester, it could have been a piece of false information designed to be followed to expose how the person dealt with it, and if the information was passed on, the military would have searched the place in question, proving that the information was passed on. And I believe that this must be some way connected with the spiring theory. But the other possibility is that the information which was given to the clergyman may have ended up being sent by letter to the authorities and with Beale's name associated with the information, and that letter may have been apprehended or viewed by others. I believe that this was the only information Beale ever passed on, and that it was a misfortunate test. It could be anticipated that many Quakers might fail such a test if they felt someone's life was at stake. I believe the comment when Beale was shot that it was a reprisal for the executions referred to the executions of the men captured at the Dripsey ambush and executed at Ballincollig. And the people who shot Beale may have been waiting until 1923 to find further evidence against him, but failed to do so, because he was in fact not spying. It may have been an element of settling of scores near the end of the Civil War by people who may genuinely but incorrectly have believed that he was part of aspiring. They were probably they may have been still wanting to find excuses for what happened at Dripsey, may even have wanted some further form of resolution to that incident, or to diffuse the blame by spreading the responsibility further. And Beale may have been seen as a scapegoat for the misfortunes at Dripsey. From some very cursory readings of my own, apparently not much was happening around Dripsey during the early part of the War of Independence, and the local volunteers were strongly encouraged to involve themselves in some action. And they came up with a plan for ambush of a military patrol which was visible to all and sundry. And they were openly training or waiting when they were observed by Mrs. Lindsay. And she decided that she did not want to see any bloodshed, and that they should be told to stop what they planned, and that she intended to report it. And she told the local priest that she intended to go to the barracks at Ballincollig and report it, and she told the priest to tell the fellows involved to call off their intended ambush. And as we know, that was not what happened. The priest did pass on the information, but those in charge of the volunteers decided to ignore it, or they may have been reluctant to call it off because they were being pressured to engage the military. Mrs. Lindsay and her driver went to Ballincollig and reported the planned ambush. The volunteers got in position for the ambush at Dripsey, but the expected military patrol did not arrive. However, the military came around behind the volunteers much later and captured a number of them. They were held in the barracks in Ballincollig for some days. Eventually, Mrs. Lindsay and her driver were taken hostage, presumably to try to get release of the prisoners. At least 5 of the men who were taken prisoner at Dripsey were executed. Mrs. Lindsay and her driver were executed also, and the locations of their bodies has not been divulged. This caused huge upset in the community at the time because of the taking hostage and execution of a woman. That was a line that they did not cross at that time. The Nationalist Division threatened to make an equal number of reprisals to the execution of the men captured at Dripsey, but they were criticised and warned against further violence by their national leadership because the taking of Mrs. Lindsay crossed the line and turned many people against them and their cause. Tom Barry made a recording where he spoke about the relatively small number of West Cork men that he worked with as volunteers during the War of Independence. He stated that their targets were the military and the elements of the state. If people identified informers, they could not allow them to survive, as they were endangering the lives of the relatively small number of their men who were vastly outnumbered by the military. They had a policy of zero tolerance for informers, and nonetheless, some civilians in some circumstances were warned and given a chance to leave. Now, I think the shooting of William Goff Beale may have been based on faulty information. It may have been based on a test which Beale, as an evangelical Quaker, could not reasonably be expected to pass. Gerard Murphy's book would seem to suggest that the people involved believed there was at least some justification for their actions. And as I said, I believe that on one occasion only, Beale did pass on one possibly false piece of information which was given to him in the shop, in exceptional circumstances involving the missing woman. Circumstantial evidence such as his involvement in the YMCA might have established an incorrect conclusion based on reasonable inferences. There are good reasons why circumstantial evidence is not generally acceptable in a court of law. And as for subsequent Civil War politics in Cork, I imagine that there would have been a deep-rooted mistrust of the more nationalist politicians by certain groups in the community for generations as a result of the shooting of William Goff Beale. So the library, sorry now, this computer has gone to sleep, I'd say, but that's more or less all of the presentation. I just want to say that the building where Beale worked is now the city library. When he worked there, when he ran his business, the people of Cork came there to purchase oil, paint, lead, glass, farm machinery, fertiliser, seeds, and insurance. And I think it's appropriate that that place now is a place that fosters free democratic education and research for all the people of the city, the wider community and beyond. And I hope that this might be a step towards establishing truth and maybe finding better ways to live peacefully. Thank you. I just have the slide, this has come back to life. Just mention, I don't know if you're into handwriting, and that was an attempt to do a family tree of Beale from 7 generations down with who they married and all the rest of it, and then 5 generations of his third cousin, Abraham Beale, who died of typhus in the famine times. So that's just that slide. And no, sorry.